while you were recruited?
Yes. I stepped into dead man's shoes. In other words, the 4 original pilots who had been selected for the program, it included the detachment commander to be one Chris Walker. And they had already gone to from England to Texas, to Del Rio, for training. But Chris Walker was killed in a training accident.
Was he actually flying you too?
Yes, it was a night exercise. It's believed he had an oxygen failure, which was quite prevalent at the time, although we were never told the real cause. He just died. He crashed from a great height on a night exercise. At that time at Del Rio, apparently they'd had several accidents and he was just 1 of 3 or 4. What this did, it deprived this small British detachment of 4 pilots of the leader.
Right.
In other words, he was a squad leader, the others were flight lieutenants. So this presented them with a slight problem. Either they promoted somebody from the other 3 or they brought somebody else in. By sheer coincidence, I had some experience of high altitude flying. In fact, I possibly had the most experience in the RAF of high altitude flying because I was involved in a project for sampling nuclear explosions at vast altitude in a rocket-propelled camera. And I was returning from Christmas. I'd been to Christmas Island for this test. And I was on my way back. This was in August 58. And it was sheer coincidence. I'd finished with the nuclear test program. I was flying the aircraft back to England. And then I was really in limbo. At that stage, I was actually employed by the Ministry of Supply as a test pilot at RAE Bedford. In fact, I mean, it is clearly they were looking for someone to replace Chris Walker quickly. There was someone who had experience of high altitude flying, which was fairly rare. I mean, up to 65,000 feet. And I was actually flying over England. I was crossing England from the south coast. I was going to land at Waddington in Lincolnshire. And a voice came over the RT. I mean, this is absolutely true, saying, I think I was a flight lieutenant then, Flight Lieutenant Robinson, land immediately and report to the Assistant Chief of Air Staff in MOD.
What have I done wrong?
Well, I'd done lots of things wrong, and it did occur to me that all was not well. Yeah. I landed, I went to London, and I met Ackers Ops, Assistant Chief of Air Staff Operations, who was then an Air Marshal Grandy. In fact, didn't know me. So I mean, I'm just rabbiting on. How did I get the job? I was a flight lieutenant, but when I went into the office, into his assistant's office, and that was, let us say, a squad leader, Ross. I remember his name. The fat sounds so Ross. That was his PA, the Ackers Ops' PA. But he opened the door to Ackers Ops and said, Squadron Leader Robinson is here. So I thought, promotion. And I went in, and all he said was, in fact, he had been out at Christmas Island, this Air Marshal Grandy, during this test. And he said, can you go to America tomorrow? And, well, I had really nothing to do. He said, I can't tell you what it's about. He said, it's flying it involves flying at high altitude and then working in Europe somewhere. Well, it seemed a reasonable sort of deal. So I said, yeah. And then he took me along to see the Vice Chief of the Air Staff, this was, it seemed to me, for a minor flight lieutenant, it was pretty sort of rarefied atmosphere I was now involved in. And the Vice Chief said, "Have you got any hobbies?" What's that? He said, "I suggest you take up," I remember this distinctly, he said, "I suggest you take up butterfly collecting." The significance of this had escaped me at the time, because he knew I was going to Turkey, see, and I didn't. And he knew I was going to be bored out of my mind. But what he was saying was I needed a hobby, and butterfly collecting, and apparently he was an expert, and apparently there lots of butterflies in Turkey. I say, the significance went straight over my head that I should take up butterfly collecting. But when the Vice Chief suggested you do not argue, so I just went off, and I was just, honestly, I had no papers, no documents. He said, I just got a ticket, and I got on a plane, and I went to Washington, and I was told, of course, there's a British Defence Mission in Washington, BDS. I don't know what they call themselves now. It wasn't in the embassy then. They had their own office, BDS, 1800 K Street, I think it was. I just arrived there, and I met some group captain. Now, I had no idea what I was doing. But I knew some girls in Washington. And I had lunch with them, and they worked on the embassy staff. And I think they had a rough idea what this was all about. But then I was whisked off then. Then I got involved going to the Pentagon. I was just sort of shuffled around people in Washington without anyone really saying what I was going to do. And then it became clear I was going to go to Del Rio for training. But then when people sort of sussed me out and had a look at me, I was then taken to CIA headquarters on G Street. That was before they moved out to... The real headquarters was at Foggy Bottom.
Oh, right.
Before they moved to Langley. But they had an office on G Street, which was where our little office operated from. And I was shuffled around between the Pentagon, G Street, BDS, and eventually the people in BDS didn't know what I was going to do. And that was interesting. They didn't really not know. But then eventually I was taken to the CIA headquarters, and they explained what it was all about. And then said, "But now you must go for training." So I spent a little time in Washington, and they were very nice to me. And then I went down to Del Rio. I just jumped on a plane, went to Del Rio in Texas, and spent from August until December training. Just converting onto the airplane. Don't forget, Del Rio was a SAC base, SAC training base. It was a massive training school, and they converted all people to the U-2 there. Therefore, it wasn't an agency organisation, it was a Strategic Air Command organisation. The other American pilots, of course, had been converted by the CIA, or they'd done it out at the ranch or out in California somewhere. When I got to Del Rio, of course, there were the other three British pilots. That was MacArthur and the other three anyway. Who, of course, were now well into their training and nearly complete. And I was just starting, so I had 2 or 3 months to catch up.
So once you, what was it like to fly?
Well, it was not an easy aeroplane to fly. It was different. Don't forget, I was quite not being big-headed, but don't forget, I'd been in the test pilot world then for several years. Therefore, one was used to flying different types of plane, which most people in the RAF are not used to. In fact, that's why initially they selected 4 QFIs, those people who were instructors from CFS, because they assumed they would be the best possible pilots to get hold of. But these people had no experience of an aircraft like that. So I had no QFI experience. I was the first test pilot. But to me, one plane was much like another. Even so, it was an unusual plane. I mean, you've seen it, you know the plane, obviously.
Yeah.
And its real problem is, of course, it has just two wheels, the tandem wheels, which is fair. And also, of course, it has nothing to keep it up. It's just like a glider, nothing to keep it up when you land. Eventually the wing falls on the ground. And for a jet aircraft, it was unusual that you landed like an old type aeroplane. You landed tail down. Most modern jets you throw down on three wheels and it stays on the ground. So it had, what was it like to fly? It was very heavy. I mean, it was heavy on the controls. Sorry, yes, this is obviously just a preamble.
Yes, okay, right. Right, so it was a heavy aircraft, did you say?
Well, to fly, it was just totally different, really. You see, because you had manual controls, I mean, most modern planes had power controls, so it was very heavy, a heavy thing to fly. But having flown other aircraft at high altitude, particularly the Canberra, it really came into its own at high altitude. It was good. It was happier when it got higher up, when it got high altitude. Its real problem was it would never have been accepted into British service. It would never have passed, as they say, it would never have got through Boscombe Down, which is the test centre, because it was structurally unsound. Whereas for British planes to be flown by military pilots, in theory you mustn't be able to destroy this thing. It must, whatever you do, it's supposed to not fall apart.
Yeah.
This is the only aeroplane I'd flown which, if you were ham-fisted, you could destroy it. If you pull back on the stick, the tail would fall off. And this happened often, you see. A lot of people were killed. And I mean, there were some classic accidents where another jet aircraft would see this thing coming down low. I think there was a classic Sabre dived down, pulled in front of him, and of course the jet stream, the thing just flew apart. It was to fly at high altitude, it had to be light. Therefore, it was structurally weak.
Did it have an ejector seat?
This is a bone of contention. Initially, it didn't have an ejector seat. During training, we had ejection seats. But American ejection seats, I don't think you realise, had a very bad reputation. In other words, Martin Baker was always the best seat in the world. Americans were years behind us in ejection seat technology. So even the aircraft with the first ejection seats, it killed a lot of people, the ejection seat. They didn't get out. The operational aircraft, when we got to Turkey, did not have ejection seats, which we objected to. And they were fitted really at British request. Because, but the Americans were quite happy not to have ejection seats. Don't forget, an ejection seat is heavy. For every pound of weight, you lose a foot in altitude. So you've got to work it out. 100 pounds is 100 feet. What do you want to be, high and secure?
Yeah. We
wanted ejection seats because in the RAF you're just used to ejection seats, and you were used to a Martin Baker seat, which always worked, and 0-0, we were used to good seats. American seats had a very poor reputation. It was interesting, on this trip to Auchenbury, they now got a 0-0 seat in their latest U2.
What's the 0-0 seat?
Well, it means you can fire it at 0 height and 0 speed, and you will survive.
So if you put it here, it would...
That's right, you will survive, because it has rockets on it. The early seats, you could, particularly in those days, 30 years ago, you needed a certain height for the thing to work. It just went off on a cartridge. And you needed a certain forward speed, like 90 knots and say 50 feet at least for the thing to deploy the parachute. But now the criteria is, and like something like a Harrier, which is, the engine stops, it must work at 0 height and 0 speed, and that's the criteria for a seat now.
Right, I see.
But in those days, I say the American seat was poor, but there were ejection seats fitted during on the training aircraft, the SAC aircraft, but not on the operational aircraft. We were talking about something else, though.
No, that was about the...
We're talking about something else.
You were just saying about the quality of the plane.
Yes, it was a plane which you had to treat with considerable respect. It had a very limited what do you call it? It's the VE. VE is velocity never to exceed. And if you see a U-2 take off, in fact I got some film of it, if you see a U-2 take off, I mean it's unusual, it takes off and then climbs very steeply. This isn't a gimmick. The reason he's doing that is to stay within the limiting speed. The thrust of this engine, what you had an engine there with the same thrust as the weight of the aircraft. So, in theory, you could climb vertically. In other words, you had an aircraft weighing 14,000 pounds and an engine with a thrust of 14,000 pounds. It doesn't quite work vertically, but it's nearly. You can climb very, very steeply. If you see most jets take off, they accelerate very fast and then pull up. If you see U-2, it goes like that immediately. This is so it doesn't go too fast. It had very, very tight limits. It had very, very close limits, which you had to observe. It had G limits as well. In turbulent weather, any G, you could tear the wings off. So when you were flying it, you were very aware of the fact this was a fragile airplane. Very, very fragile. But once you got up high, of course, where the stresses were lower, fine, it worked really well. I mean, it was happy when it was flying very, very high. And the way I put it was that the U-2 at 70,000 feet felt like most aircraft do at 35,000. It was very, very happy at high altitude, where, of course, the airspeed is low, the stresses are low. Yeah. Lower down, where it's all bumps and... the last thing you did was go through a cloud if you could avoid it. And never would you go through a thunderstorm. Whereas another jet aircraft, you can just go straight through a thunderstorm. You get bumped around a bit, but it isn't going to come apart. Right. You wouldn't have dreamt of going through a thunderstorm. It's like flying a glider. I mean, if you're a glider pilot, you realise this thing is liable to come apart on you if you're not careful.
So you went up to Incirlik, where you?
And then I finished the training. The other guys had gone ahead of me, and then we went to Incirlik in Turkey.
And when did you actually arrive there?
I arrived there, I arrived there on January the 1st, 1959, because I had New Year's Eve in Ankara with a CIA agent. And we went to a nightclub that night. And CIA agents are funny at a lower level, because they all behave like Humphrey Bogart. They all dress in white raincoats and slouch hats and dark glasses. And they go to enormous lengths not to have their photographs taken. So, what happens in a nightclub on New Year's Eve when the girl's going around taking photographs at the table? This guy will be sort of doing this so no one took his photograph. Which all that does is it draw attention to itself. But then, when you were told... Actually, they had a really good organisation. When you went to an airport, someone was you had a sort of minder to get you through. You went through on your own, but there was someone there in case you got into trouble. I mean, it was quite a good organisation. But if all went well, you never actually met the bloke, but and you knew him immediately. He was the bloke in the white raincoat and the slouch hat. I mean, they stood like a dog's balls. I mean, they really were. Because they were at that lower level, were sort of pretty limited mentality. It'd be like a village bobby, it was like policemen in England, not the sharpest blokes in the world. But they were there all around. I mean, sometimes we go through customs with 3 passports, 3 different identities. Now, this is okay, because you need the 3 identities.
They sheep dipping. What they call sheep dipping.
Oh, they try to change your name and things.
Oh, the way that you go in as a military person, and
yes.
They change your whole...
Oh, it was so confusing that you never knew who... I mean, you get sort of... You'd either be I could be either a British civilian, British officer, I could be American Army, I could... Yes. But the thing is, after a while you get confused as to who you are. And they certainly had identity problems. I reckon they had psycho problems, some of these people. They forgot who they were and what their names were. To us it was just... And this is a difference between mentality. I mean, British mentality is totally different from American. And this was discovered during the war, during training. Yeah. Oh, you saw that thing, Top Gun, where they eat sort of square meals and things. No, they actually do that, in military training. And this is really because I think America is such a large country and the lowest common denominator is pretty bloody low. You've got to get everyone down at the same level. And they're not used to self-discipline or any discipline. But all this eating square meals and Mr. So-and-so, Mr. So-and-so, it works well for them, but it does not work well with British pilots or British personnel who are used to using a bit of initiative. And, so the whole of their training, I thought, was... You could see it's vast. It's on a vast scale. Therefore, it must be reduced to a low common denominator. Whereas, I think in England, you can consider people to be actually individuals. But this is just... anyway, they make it work. They train pilots. They do it their way. And really, you can't argue against it. But
I know technically we only talk to a lot of them. I know the kind of thing. Gutsy, but not always terribly bright.
No, well, they used to object to us a bit because we actually used initiative. If you were sent off to do something and it was cloudy, well, if you're British, you go and do something else. You don't faff around trying to do what you're supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
Cloud is cloud. But they took up section of that. Well, you were only authorised to do that.
I see.
Yeah.
So you arrived at Incirlik and did you get flying fairly quickly, or did it take a while?
Yes. The weather was better, but really, what we did then, of course, they were clearly anxious that there'd be some British overflights as soon as possible. And of course, this raises the whole question: why were the British involved in war? Why? It's so much simpler to use their own pilots. Why did they use British pilots? I mean, what do you think? Well, why did they bother?
I thought it was just the sort of Allies trying to split the blame if anybody got caught.
Yeah, that's right. That's to a degree, is sharing political risk. Because, I mean, that was one aspect of it. Don't forget, there's a very close interchange of intelligence information between Brits and America. They don't trust us, and we don't trust. I mean, we've had more disasters with spies than they have. I mean, they've had a few disasters, but we've had some pretty bad disasters, really.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
On the other hand, of course, I think in those days we had the one-up on them in Eland and in intercept of messages. Cheltenham is... Yes. I think we were just better at it because I think we're better at languages, or we employ people who understood Russian dialect. So I think we had something in it for them. But therefore they used to give us the take on this, all the films and things. But clearly we were getting when the U-2 started to produce photographs, this was at that stage, the most productive source of information on Russia that was going. Nothing else could compare with it. Not little guys with cameras crossing borders. So it was sharing political risk. If something went wrong, someone had to take the blame. But I think there were two other aspects. You're very much controlled, particularly the Americans, on what they can do on overflights. Obviously, the whole thing is politically controlled. And Americans they bump along from one election to the next. And although it's 4 years to elect a president, for the year before, on his rundown, no risks are taken. and I think you'll find this not just in the intelligent world. They take no political risk. They make no foreign policy decisions in that year, which can screw them up. After the election, the next year, the new guy is sort of being briefed, and he's got to be told the hairy old stories of what's going on. So you lose virtually two. And the other thing is, if they're going to a conference or a summit, you can't. I mean, it's very dangerous to be in the country when one of your planes is flying, because they may keep you there. Yeah. So there were limitations on when you could have a flight.
Yes, of course. And I suppose the Americans thought that the Americans and the CIA thought if they couldn't get permission to do something, they could induce the British to do it.
That's right. Yes, yes. I mean, the Americans, just because the CIA and America, I mean, they would play. I mean, their own government. You know, because we became fairly chummy with the CIA reps. Their own government was far more frustrating. I mean, Macmillan was great. I mean, Macmillan couldn't give a stuff. I mean, he just went to bed when there was an overflight. Well, I think the president used to stay up all night biting his fingers. But I mean, they just, Cullywalling.
How many flights did you actually do, operational flights?
Oh, well, I'm not going to say that, but over Russia, no.
Well, I mean,
but don't forget, our bread and butter work, most of the work was not over Russia. It was over the Middle East. And I mean, there were several flights a week over. And this to me was, this was the greatest source of information. Because we could do an order of battle for the whole of the Middle East with 2 aeroplanes on one day. We could cover every single airfield, every single plane on one day with 2 planes would take off, one will go east, one will go west, one will go. And on that you could count, you knew where every single aircraft, virtually every single tank, you knew where everything was in the Middle East. Well, this was really the most productive source because the weather was so good, you could do it virtually by clockwork. Flights over Russia were controlled very much by weather. And don't forget, there were no satellites, there were no weather satellites. The Russians did not broadcast weather reports like you do. So, forecasting the weather. See, and if you're going to go to one place, it doesn't mean that somewhere else in Russia the weather is going to be good. Weather forecasting was a major problem. But in the Middle East, where it's sunny all day long, you could virtually run like a clock, like a bus timetable. And this, to me, I thought was. See, nobody knew that all over the Middle East, everybody knew. We knew where everybody was, including Israel. Now, the Israelis were not happy about planes. They were the only people who latched on that planes were flying over them, and they were not happy at all. The Syrians knew because across from Incirlik, on top of a mountain, was a radar station in Syria, and they could see us taking off, and they could see us going towards Syria. But nobody else knew. Nobody. It was just too high for them. But the Israelis knew, and the Syrians knew. But literally, we go right down to Sudan, all over Egypt, Libya, all over Saudi, right across to the Emirates, right up through Iraq. The whole of that area was covered in one day by 2 planes. And the Canberras used to say, for us to cover that would take, a squadron of aircraft a month. Well, of course, to do an order of battle, you have to do it virtually simultaneously. You must do it on the same day. So that to me I thought that was clever. And the most useful information, of course, was that the ELIN trips for all the rocket launcher, for all the missile launchers from Russia, because everybody knew they were working up to a manned space flight. So there was tremendous interest in any space launch. And I thought that was that you could really see intelligence working there because they knew when it was going to go. They knew in advance what was. Of course, although somewhere from Kasputin Yar, don't forget Kasputin Yar was short-range missile test center, but when they start using Tayuratam, anything there going into space went from Tayuratam. Now this didn't involve actually flying over Russia. It involved flying right along the border in Iran, as close as you could get. But these, to me, were the most productive flights because you had of course, you had a different configuration. You had an enormous tape recorder there, which recorded all the telemetry of the rocket. But we were not the only people involved then. I mean, on the same base at Incirlik, you had the US Navy, you had SAC, us. You had 3 or 4 detachments, and no one told anybody else what they were doing, but it was significant. You know, we all took off on the same day. Everybody knew that something was on that day. But because we flew higher and got closer, we possibly got more information.
With the you had you were flying mixed. Generally, your overflights were what, mixed photography and ELINT?
Yes, you always carried some ELINT, but clearly on overflights of Russia or the Middle East, you were basically interested in photography, and that you had the B camera, the big configuration, which took up the whole of the equipment bay. I mean, it was an enormous camera. But stretched throughout the aircraft, there were other recorders recording ELINT tape. But on genuine things like the rocket launchers or real ELINT fans, there was a entirely different configuration, which was a massive tape recorder, really, which was recorded presumably right across the span of frequency.
When the photography, you could do thousands of miles, couldn't you?
Yes, I mean, see, that was because they developed this very thin film, you see, this mile of film. So I think you had something like a mile of film in there. You had one camera which was on the whole time, from takeoff to landing. So there you had a camera, just a small camera, which literally could be on for 10 hours. Recording, and it knew exactly where you'd be, the whole way. From horizon to horizon. That camera could tell you, anybody, where you'd be. But that wasn't good enough for intelligence. But the big camera, which, I say, had lots of film, but not unlimited, that you only put on, of course, as you approach the target. Clearly, there was a lot of nothing in between. You know. As you know, 99% of these countries is nothing.
Can you give me some idea of the number? Without being specific, I mean, did you do a dozen, dozens, or hundreds of flights over the unit?
No, if there were dozens done, that's as much as you are going to get. Yes.
Yeah.
No. Although there seemed to be a lot. I mean, there seemed to be, when it got to a peak, there seemed to be like one a week. But when you actually analyse the total numbers, there were great pauses, great gaps in it. And I think what had happened before we came on the scene, they hadn't done anything for ages, for a long time, purely for political reasons.
Yeah, I've got quite a few of the documents that have been released. I talked to General Guthauster, Eisenhower. He used to do all the improvements of this sort. And there's quite a lot of, we think it's a bit sensitive this month, lay off, it's kind of those kind of.
That's something, yes. I mean, that's why it all went, as you know, I mean, why did they take the risk on May the 1st, on the Powers flight? I mean, it seemed a very inappropriate time to go, when there was going to be.
They sort of misjudged it as well, because they didn't realise it would finish on May the 1st.
I told them that. Yeah. They had no idea the significance of May the 1st. Yeah. I said, you're mad to go on that day. No, because it was purely because it was really from the 14th to the 18th it was approved. No, the 14th to the 28th.
Yeah.
But they needed the picture, and they gave 2 more days, and they hadn't realised that. But although it was still the 30th in Washington, it was May the 1st in Russia. They'd misjudged it by a day. I said, but everyone's on Lenin's tomb that day. Yeah. Clearly all their defences will be on very high alert. But no one seemed to twig onto it.
What were the main sort of, besides the telemetry stuff, I mean, what did you get the impression that the emphasis, what they were looking for with the photography, what was? What did you think at the time?
Well, the Americans had entirely different priorities to the British. Don't forget, the priorities of targets really come out of your central, presumably reconnaissance, intelligence gathering agencies. I think in England you have an intelligence board, and you get representatives from each of the services and presumably from civilians. We're interested in, if it's the Navy, they want to obviously look at shipbuilding. If it's the Army, they want to look at tank production. Yeah. The Air Force wants... Now, the RAF and the USAF, the Americans really, and particularly SAC, and don't forget you had these tremendous personalities in SAC then. That's right, and power. Now, they had conned their government, rightly or wrongly, in believing that the Russians had thousands of missiles and thousands of bombers. And really the justification for getting their own Air Force expanded was on the grounds that there was a target. Well, they certainly, I remember attending briefings in Washington when they would say, and this is that used to frighten me. I remember one briefing where the chap said, well, we have at the present 900 ballistic missiles, and the Russians have 850. But next, in 6 months' time, they will have 1,050. They will have the predominance. This guy jumped up and said, "Okay, let's go. Let's take them out now." Christ Almighty! There's a senior officer suggesting that because, at the moment the Americans had more, but shortly the Russians are going to have more, it seemed to be a good opportunity to go to nuclear war. This was a sort of mentality. Yeah. They used to frighten me. They're naive. I think Americans are a bit naive, personally.
Well, completely isolated politically, aren't they? They sort of have a strange world.
But also, this is absolute fact that until the time of Power's flight, not a single operational missile had ever been found. Not one. Not one single site. The test centres, of course, were known, but no operational site had ever been located. And that's why his flight was important, because they were going to go to, some place begins with a P or something. No, Sverdlovsk was an industrial centre. Yeah. He was going over there. He was going to some place that begins with a P in the north, where they thought there was an operational, and I think there was actually. But they never found any. The other thing, the fallout that came out of this, because as you went along taking film, other things appeared, naturally. The thing that, and I was shown lots of the pictures, the American parts were never shown anything. Again, the British government treated us as if we had something between our bloody ears. So at least they talked to us about it. In fact, the American pilots said we learn more from your visitors than we learn from our own, because Americans operate on this thing, need to know. You don't tell the guy anything in case he's caught. Whereas our reps were quite good. They used to explain things to us.
So you used to pick up other buildings?
The thing that really, again, at that stage I hadn't realised significant, but certainly surprised me, the number of chemical and biological plants which they found. And at that stage, don't forget, in the late 50s, it was not, we knew about CW and BW, but it was not something on, we didn't have the suits and everything. It was not something on everyone's mind, to be quite honest. But they certainly, just as a fallout, they picked up lots of these production plants. And I don't know whether you can ever get access. I mean, at that stage, you take a photograph, vertical photograph, and of course it's done in stereo, so you get a stereo, therefore you can tell the heights of buildings. But from that you get these people who drew the most amazing oblique drawings, and they'd show you this site. Of course now it'd all be done on a computer, wouldn't it? The way you can just produce the thing on a computer from a plan view and a side elevation. But people actually drew these. And they draw these amazing drawings of this site, showing you the various buildings. That used to impress me, considering 30 years ago. But there were lots and lots of CW and BW and biological plants. And they just sort of appeared, really. What they did find out was, of course, that the RAF was looking for bombers. We thought that their threat was from fixed-wing aircraft. And we used to look at factories making bombers. The Americans, in the main, were concentrating on missile sites and missile production. I think that was a fundamental difference between our targeting. We found airfields and we found factories, but they didn't find anything. In fact, I don't know, I get the impression that really the Russians didn't have too many missiles in those days. I don't know.
There's one reference in one of the books, saying that the U2 actually discovered a city or two that weren't known.
Well, that's possible, because in fact they say that Tyura town is named after the railway head. The nearest place they could ever... It was found by accident, Tyura town. It was just found on some other mission. It was called Tyura town. I mean, the Russians called it Star City, because that was the nearest railhead to it, which was still some way away. And as you know, they have built cities and towns, particularly for developing nuclear, discovering them now, because